Hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So, welcome to the Nerd Show. This is the nerdiest day of the year here on this channel because I am taking a deep dive into all of the anal, nerdy, pointless, but enjoyable to me charts that I keep for all of my reading from my collection spreadsheet and from my yearly reading spreadsheet. We're gonna just do a deep dive into how 2018 went. I know, I think some people really love these kinds of videos and other people don't care. And anyway, I really like keeping track of this stuff. It's really fun for me. As of 2018, I now have 8 years worth of data to reflect on, which I think is really fun. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start by talking about my collection stats. So I have a spreadsheet, which I will link in the cards somewhere, my series of how I do like collection tracking and management, but I have like the spreadsheet with all the books that I own in it, and like I keep track of various metrics related to my collection. So we'll start with that, and then we'll move into my actual like this year in reading type stats, which I will do for this year, but I also have, like I said, 8 years worth of data, so I will do some year over year comparisons on things like how many books I read, publishing year, things like that. So without much further ado, let's dive into the nerdery. Okay, and I'm envisioning that right here is where I'm going to put all these charts for you guys to look at. So first, let's talk about net changes to my TBR in my collections. So as you can see for the graph, like over time, I started with almost all physical books and almost no ebooks because ebooks have only been a thing for like 10-ish years. And then as you can see, slowly those lines swapped. I got really into finding, well, especially like when I was in the middle of doing like my big paper about romance for grad school, I got so many books for free on ebook and I was just having to read a lot. So like I was glomming them in. Then I did a big clear out of my TBR, as you can also see in this chart. And like ever since then, my goal has been to keep my physical TBR books around 50 and my e-TBR books around 150. Don't always do that well, but I think I'm ending the year in the 60s for physical and the 160s for ebook. So like not terrible. That is a lot of books, guys. I'm fully aware of that. But like my philosophy, just so you know, on collection management is that at any one time, I want roughly half the books in my collection to be ones I have not yet read. I don't feel like a compulsion to only to keep my TBR to 0. Some people are very focused on that and that is totally fine. But for me, I always want a lot of options because I'm a mood reader and I want a lot of things around that I haven't read, and I'm somebody who also unhauls quite a bit, so like when I'm done reading it, I want it gone so that I can get a new book, kind of a thing. So anyway, that was sort of how I did on my TBR this year. As you can see, kind of peaks and valleys, ending the year a little higher than I'd like to, but all things considered pretty good. You can also kind of see that shift in my kind of how I think about collecting books over the last few years in this chart, which sort of shows you the composition of my collection. So as you can see, I've definitely moved to being much more sort of like 2/3 ebook, 1/3 physical. A lot of that is because I've moved so much over the years that once I realized that I really like, basically my philosophy is anything that I in the past would have gotten as like a mass market or even like some like not as nice paperbacks, I don't want them in that form. I want them as an ebook. I want my physical books to be mostly hardbacks and mostly books that I want to keep for a long time. So anyway, that's sort of like the philosophy shift there. And I do have some audiobooks, but that is a very small part of my collection. So as you can see, pretty consistent with last year. Really from 2014 to 2016 was when I was sort of implementing that policy. And now like I think we'll probably be pretty stable at about 2/3 e, 1/3 physical. And then this chart is basically just showing kind of like the net changes in acquisitions that I have on a month-to-month basis in my collection. So basically on a month-to-month basis, did I add more books to my collection or did I lose more books in my collection? As you can maybe see from this, in 2014, there was like a big increase in my overall collection, and then there was like a great purge in 2016 and 17. For 2018, I did, however, add a lot to my TBR, which is going to drive some of my goals for 2019, namely that I want to kind of cool my jets a little bit next year in terms of what I'm bringing into the collection because I have a lot and I want to focus on kind of getting that back down a little bit. So 2018 was comparatively, especially to 16 and 17, more of a getting books in kind of year, and I'm hoping 2019 might be more of a getting rid of books kind of year, but this just kind of shows the ebbs and flows of that over time. Okay, and then finally, a couple of things that are always just interesting to me in monitoring in my collection. One is what are the ratings in my collection of books that I have read, like what is that distribution? And then the other is how new are the books that I have in my collection. So in terms of ratings, as you can see over time, I've had more lower rated things in my collection, and that is because once I buy an ebook, I don't get rid of it. So even if I don't end up liking that ebook, it stays in my collection. So it kind of stays in my distribution. Whereas when I was reading only like really purely physical books, it was a lot, my average rating in my collection was a lot higher because I was only keeping ones I really liked. So that's definitely changed over time. The other thing that has changed over time, as you can see, is that I do read a lot more front list than I used to. And again, in 19, I'm wanting to kind of remind myself of how much I like backlist and lean into that a little bit more. But over time, my collection has skewed more towards front list. So that's just a change that I have observed and continued to observe in 2018. Okay, so moving into how I did in 2018-ness of it all, let's start with, and I'm not sure how I'm gonna show you this. I may not really be able to show you this, so I may just have to kind of talk. So forgive me if I'm not making as much eye contact as I would like because my screen is right here. So in terms of a couple of stats that I always track, so some demographic things. One is I always track percentage of male versus female versus like unknown authors in what I'm reading. And when I started tracking this in 2011, I think my percentages were like 44% male, then in 2012 it was 54, and then in 2013 it was 64% male. So at that point I was like, I'm cutting this off, I'm gonna start reading more female written books, and I have driven hard in that direction. So now like my goal has actually been to read more because it got down to like 4% at one point. So this year it was 15, which was up over last year's 10. So there you go. I do just read a lot of genre fiction and a lot of like female oriented nonfiction. So I just do tend to read a lot of female authors. So there is an interesting stat. I know that a lot of people are trying to focus on reading more women authors, and that at one point was a concern of mine and is no longer. Audiobook wise, last year I started rediscovering how much I liked audiobooks. About 9% of what I read last year was on audio, and this year it was 17. So I read, I think, 15 audiobooks last year. It looks like I read 45 this year. And then one new thing I started tracking this year is the category I called Not Like Me, and basically where there is either the author or the main character, those are my two criteria, are somebody who is in a meaningful way not like me, be that religion, race, sexuality, something like that, where I am getting an other voice perspective in a way that I wouldn't normally. And last year I had 13% of my books that were not like me, and my goal was to get to 20, and I actually got to 30 this year, which is great. Ultimately, I would probably like to get to the point where it's like 50-50. So good progress, still progress to be made. So that was a new stat I started tracking. The other thing I started tracking this year was my percentage of YA, because I was feeling like I was reading a lot of YA, and I did. I read 21 YA books, but that was only actually like 8% of the new books that I read this year. So that's something that I'll start tracking going forward. Another interesting stat for me was the average age of books. So my goal is for my average age of a book to be 10 years in a given year. And I have not done that since 2014. I've been reading, like I said, more and more front list, and this year my average age was 6.5 years, but this is the first year where the mode age was 0, meaning that the most frequent publication year I had for 2018 was 2018. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think that's really me. And I have so many backlist books I want to read that I do want to focus more on that next year. So that's an interesting takeaway for me, kind of looking at how this went. So moving into like average rating kind of thing. So this is interesting because my perception of this reading year was that it was a really good one. So typically the way I think about ratings is that if something like met my expectations, it gets a 3-star. So anything that is above a 3-star is like doing good. And I had a run in 2014 through 2016 where my average rating for the year was below 3 stars. And some of that is because I was kind of picking up some new genres, still figuring out what I liked in those genres. And I think that meant that I just had more misses and I wasn't picking books that I would like as much. Like I was doing not as good of a job picking books I would like, is the way I'm what I'm trying to say. But last year I did a little bit better. I got to 3.06, and this year I got to 3.13. And what that tells me is that even though I'm reading I read more this year than I have in the last couple, I read very widely and diversely, it's paying off. Like, I'm reading books I like, and I think it just reminds me that I do know myself as a reader more and more every year. Like, I'm just getting better at picking books that I think I'm gonna like. So I think that's cool, and that's encouraging to me. So the rating I gave out the most often was a 3-star, but my overall average was a 3.13. So that is encouraging. Very cool that I get to kind of see how that's panning out. And then a couple of other just overall stats. One is that average tenure on my TBR this year was 160 days, which is an improvement over last year because it was 200 days last year. I did spend roughly 3 times more on books this year than I normally do. That is in part because I began collecting the Penguin cloth bounds and I kind of got like really into that. But that being said, I don't really regret any of that. It was all within my book budget, and I just hadn't been using my book budget fully for the last few years. So it's all good, and I think, like I said, in 2019, I'm really going to focus on trying to read more of what I have, so I expect that to go down next year. Compared to last year, on that note though, exactly 38% of what I read I paid for, as opposed to like got it for free, got it from the used bookstore for free, got it as a gift, library, whatever. And last year was also exactly 38%. That compares to like in 2014, actually 2014 and 2015, only 1% of the books that I read I personally had paid for, and that was because I was in grad school and almost exclusively using the library at that point. So anyway, just programming note, you don't have to own books to read them. You can get them for free a lot of places. Okay, a couple of other year-over-year comparisons. So first of all, in terms of like when I was reading things, you can kind of see the breakout year-over-year that for the most part, this was a higher, like on the higher end of what I normally read month to month, volume-wise in reading. And then specifically for this year, you can see that I read a lot in, I think May was my highlight and February was my low light in terms of volume. February was when I moved last year, so that's why. I actually broke a couple of records for months this year, so I think I broke a record in July, August, and December. So yeah, I had pretty high volumes reading-wise this year, and I want to kind of try to focus on getting that down actually next year to closer to being 15 as opposed to 20. We'll see how that goes. Rating-wise, compared to the last few years, I think that I have more, like, closer to a bell curve in the last couple of years than I did, let's say, in 2011. I think, again, some of that comes down to the fact that I, like, read more boldly, like I take more risks on what I'm reading, and I think that that's kind of good that I have more variety there. But specifically, you can see that even though I did read pretty wildly in terms of things I liked, that the distribution was still right there. I think at like 3.5 and 4 kind of was a frequent rating for me. Some of the lower rated ones definitely brought the average down, but in general, I was reading books that I liked, and I think that kind of bears out in the stats. Genre-wise is definitely interesting to see kind of like when I get on kicks year over year. So you can definitely see in 2014, that's when I was doing a lot of research for that romance project. So like 2/3 of what I was reading was romance, compared to this year where I think I had a much better kind of like overall mix of things. Mystery and genre blends were definitely the things I read the most of overall, but yeah, a pretty good mix I think over like when you look at the distribution for this year, so that makes me happy. In terms of where I get books, again, you can see year over year it's changed a lot. Back when Borders was a thing, that used to be like, I used to work at Borders if you didn't know that. That used to be the source of a lot of my books, and then that went out of business, and so like, and I've started buying a lot more ebooks, so over time Amazon has become much more of a thing. In terms of where I got books this year, Amazon was my #1, followed by the library, and then I got a lot from publishers. That was actually a pretty good chunk. I read a lot of ARCs this year. I got several from the used bookstore, some as gifts. I mean, there was a variety, but yeah, Amazon is always solidly like, what is it? I think about 1/3 of where I got books this year, and that totally makes sense given how many ebooks I read. And then finally, just in terms of looking at this year's publication breakdown, I think again, you can see some sort of from the year over year comparison that over time I've been reading more and more frontlist. I think some of that is because I stay up with bookish news a lot more than I used to. So like I get hyped for things since I found BookTube, for example, and I started listening to podcasts about 7 or 8 years ago. Like all those things just mean that I tend to pay more attention to front lists than I used to. And again, in 2019, I kind of want to focus on maybe getting away from that, but you can definitely see this in the 2018 chart, just like how much of what I read was published in 2018. Some of that was that I was experimenting with requesting ARCs this year. I would say about half of the ones that I read that were published in 2018 I got as ARCs, but some of that was other stuff. And yeah, again, I'm wanting to focus a little less on front list for 2019, I think. So how, like the big final question is how many books did I read, pages, all that stuff. So in terms of new books, so I should say that with rereads, like I did a Kate Daniel reread, I did a Poirot reread, I've reread some other things. I read over 300 books, but new books, I read 270 this year, which is a lot. I read about 82,000 pages this year, which is a lot. On average, it took me about 1.35 days to get through a book, and that meant, like conversely, that means I was reading roughly 0.75 books a day this year. Again, that's a lot. And in terms of number of pages, that broke down to roughly 223 pages a day, and the average book length I had this year was 303 pages. So how does that compare year over year? This is one of the biggest reading years I've had. I believe last year I read 160. Yeah, I read 160 books last year. The year before that was like 140. The year before that, however, was 404. That was when I was doing a lot of research for that romance paper. It keeps coming up because that's sort of an anomalous year. It just skews all the year over year data in some ways. So that's why I keep bringing it up. But anyway, so definitely a higher volume reading year for me, but definitely not my highest. And next year, my goal, I think I'm going to talk about this in a video, but my goal is to read no more than 200 books and get back into kind of the 150 range. I think is a more comfortable reading pace for me, where I'm reading more like weightier books. And that's part of what I want to do in 2019 is I've been reading a ton of genre in the last few years, which is great. I really enjoy it, but I do miss making time for some of the bigger books. So I definitely want to do that. So anyway, that's kind of my big drum roll, is that I read 270 books this year. And these are some of the ways that I broke down how to think about those books. I hope somebody found this interesting. So yeah, anyway, I really like stats. I really like tracking them, and I know some people are interested, so that's why I did this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed geeking out with me a little bit about all these numbers. Definitely let me know how you did reading-wise. If you have any stats that you keep, feel free to share those. Or yeah, just how did you feel about this reading year? Did you feel like it was a good one, bad one, etc., etc. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. And I think that will do it. I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!